They ate mouldy bread for their midday meal. The French were a dark mass on the far hill, too many to count now, and the first of their infantry had arrived. A spit of rain made those archers who had their strings dangling from a bow tip hurry to coil the cords and shelter them under helmets or hats. But the small rain passed. A wind stirred the grass. And still the French came to the far hill. They were a horde. They had come to Crécy, and they had come for revenge. The English waited. Two of Skeet's archers played straw flutes, while the hoblars, who were helping to protect the guns on the army's flanks, sang songs of green woods and running streams. Some men danced the steps they would have used on a village green back home. Others slept. Many played dice, and all but the sleepers continually looked across the valley to the far hill crest that was thickening with men. Jake had a linen-wrapped lump of beeswax that he handed round the archers so they could coat their bows. It was not necessary, just something to do. "Where did you get the wax?" Thomas asked him. "Stole it, of course, off some daft man-at-arms. Saddle polish, I reckon." An argument developed over which wood made the best arrows. It was an old discussion, but it passed the time. Everyone knew ash made the best shafts, but some men liked to claim that birch or hornbeam, even oak, flew just as well. Alder, though heavy, was good for killing deer, but needed a heavy head and did not have the distance for battle. Sam took one of his new arrows from his bag and showed everyone how warped the shaft was. "Must be made of bloody blackthorn," he complained bitterly. "You could shoot that round a corner." "They don't make arrows like they used to," Will Skeet said, and his archers jeered, for it was an old complaint. "It's true," Skeet said. "It's all hurry up and no craftsmanship these days. Who cares? The bastards get paid by the sheaf, and the sheaves are sent to London, and no one looks at them till they reach us. And what are we going to do? Just look at it." He took the arrow from Sam and twisted it in his fingers. "That's not a bloody goose feather. It's a goddamn sparrow feather. No bloody use for anything except scratching your ass." He tossed the arrow back to Sam. "No, a proper archer makes his own arrows." "I used to," Thomas said. "But you're a lazy bastard now, eh, Tom?" Skeet grinned, but the grin faded as he stared across the valley. "Enough of the goddamn bastards," he grumbled, looking at the gathering French. Then he grimaced as a solitary raindrop splashed on his worn boots. "I wish it would damn well rain and get it over with. It wants to. If it pisses on us when the bastards are attacking, then we might as well run for home because the bows won't shoot." Eleanor sat beside Thomas and watched the far hill. There were at least as many men there as were in the English army now, and the French main battle was only just arriving. Mounted men-at-arms were spreading across the hill, organizing themselves into convois. A convoy was the basic fighting unit for a knight or man-at-arms, and most had between a dozen and 20 men, but those who formed the bodyguards of the great lords were much larger. There were now so many horsemen on the far hilltop that some had to spill down the slope, which was turning into a spread of colour, for the men-at-arms were wearing surcoats embroidered with their lords' badges, and the horses had gaudy trappers, while the French banners added more blue and red and yellow and green. Yet despite the colours, the dull grey of steel and mail still predominated. In front of the horsemen were the first green and red jackets of the Genoese crossbowmen. There was only a handful of these bowmen, but more and more were streaming over the hill to join their comrades. A cheer sounded from the English centre, and Thomas leaned forward to see that archers were scrambling to their feet. His first thought was that the French must have attacked, but there were no enemy horsemen and no arrows flew. "Up!" Will Skeet shouted suddenly. "On your feet!" "What is it?" Jake asked. Thomas saw the horsemen then. Not Frenchmen, but a dozen Englishmen, who rode along the face of the waiting battle line, carefully keeping their horses away from the archers' pits. 3 of the horsemen were carrying banners, and one of those flags was a huge standard showing the lilies and leopards framed in gold. "It's the king," a man said, and Skeet's archers began to cheer. The king stopped and spoke with the men in the centre of the line, then trotted on towards the English right. His escort was mounted on big destriers, but the king rode a grey mare. He wore his bright surcoat, but had hung his crowned helmet from his saddle pommel, and so was bareheaded. His royal standard, all red, gold and blue, led the flags, while behind it was the king's personal badge of the flaming sun rising, while the third, which provoked the loudest cheer, was an extravagantly long pennant which showed the fire-spewing dragon of Wessex. It was the flag of England, of the men who had fought the Conqueror, and the Conqueror's descendant now flew it to show that he was of England, like the men who cheered him as he rode the grey horse. He stopped close to Will Skeet's men and raised a white staff to silence the cheers. The archers had pulled off their helmets, and some had gone on one knee. The king still looked young, and his hair and beard were as gold as the rising sun on his standard. "I am grateful," he began in a voice so hoarse that he paused and started again. "I am grateful that you are here." That started the cheering again, and Thomas, who was cheering with the others, did not even reflect on what choice they had been given. The king raised the white staff for silence. "The French, as you see, have decided to join us. Perhaps they are lonely." It was not a great joke, but it prompted roars of laughter that turned to jeers for the enemy. The king smiled as he waited for the shouts to subside. "We came here," he then called, "only to procure the rights and lands and privileges that are ours by the laws of man and of God. My cousin of France challenges us, and in so doing he defies God." The men were silent now, listening carefully. The destriers of the king's escort were pawing the ground, but not a man moved. "God will not endure Philip of France's impudence," the king went on. "He will punish France. And you," he cast a hand to indicate the archers, "will be his instrument. God is with you, and I promise you, I swear to you before God and on my own life, that I will not leave this field till the last man of my army has marched from here. We stay on this hill together, and we fight here together, and we shall win together for God, for St. George, and for England." The cheers began again, and the king smiled and nodded, then turned as the Earl of Northampton strode from the line. The king leaned down in his saddle and listened to the Earl for a moment, then straightened and smiled again. "Is there a Master Skeet here?" Skeet immediately reddened, but did not confess his presence. The Earl was grinning. The king waited. Then a score of archers pointed at their leader. "He's here!" "Come here," the king commanded sternly. Will Skeet looked embarrassed as he threaded through the bowmen and approached the king's horse, where he went on one knee. The king drew his ruby-hilted sword and touched it on Skeet's shoulder. "We are told you are one of our best soldiers, so from henceforth you will be Sir William Skeet." The archers shouted even louder. Will Skeet, Sir William now, stayed on his knees as the king spurred on to give the same speech to the last men in the line and to those who manned the guns in the circle of farm carts. The Earl of Northampton, who had plainly been responsible for Skeet's knighthood, raised him up and led him back to his cheering men, and Skeet was still blushing as his archers clapped him on the back. "Bloody nonsense," he said to Thomas. "You deserve it, Will," Thomas said, then grinned. "Sir William." "Just have to pay more bloody tax, won't I?" Skeet said, but he looked pleased anyway. Then he frowned as a drop of rain splashed on his bare forehead. "Bowstrings!" he shouted. Most of the men were still sheltering their strings, but a handful had to coil the cords as the rain began to fall more heavily. One of the Earl's men-at-arms came to the archers, shouting that the women were to go back beyond the crest. "You heard him," Will Skeet called. "Women to the baggage!" Some of the women wept, but Eleanor just clung to Thomas for a moment. "Live," she said simply, then walked away through the rain, passing the Prince of Wales, who, with 6 other mounted men, was riding to his place among the men-at-arms behind Will Skeet's archers. The prince had decided to fight on horseback, so he could see over the heads of the dismounted men and to mark his arrival, his banner, which was bigger than any other on the right of the field, was loosed to the heavy downpour. Thomas could no longer see across the valley because wide curtains of heavy grey rain were sweeping from the north and obscuring the air. There was nothing to do but sit and wait while the leather backing of his mail became cold and clammy. He hunched miserably, staring into the greyness, knowing that no bow could draw properly till this downpour ended. "What they should do," said Father Hobb, who sat beside Thomas, "is charge now." "They couldn't find their way in this muck, Father," Thomas said. He saw the priest had a bow and an arrow bag, but no other battle equipment. "You should get some mail," he said, "or at least a padded jacket." "I'm armoured by the faith, my son." "Where's your bowstrings?" Thomas asked, for the priest had neither helmet nor cap. "I looped them round my... Oh, well, never mind. It has to be good for something other than pessing, eh? And it's dry down there." Father Hobb seemed indecently cheerful. "I've been walking the lines, Tom, and looking for your lance. It's not here." "Hardly goddamn surprising," Thomas said. "I never thought it would be." Father Hobb ignored the blasphemy. "And I had a chat with Father Pryke. Do you know him?" "No," Thomas said curtly. The rain was pouring off the front of his helmet onto the broken bridge of his nose. "How the hell would I know Father Pryke?" Father Hobb was not deterred by Thomas's surliness. "He's confessor to the king and a great man. He'll be a bishop one day soon. I asked him about the Vexil." Father Hobb paused, but Thomas said nothing. "He remembers the family," the priest went on. "He says they had lands in Cheshire, but they supported the Mortimers at the beginning of the king's reign, so they were outlawed. He said something else. They were always reckoned pious, but their bishop suspected they had strange ideas. A touch of Gnosticism." "Cathars," Thomas said. "It seems likely, doesn't it?" "And if it's a pious family," Thomas said, "then I probably don't belong. Isn't that good news?" "You can't escape, Thomas," Father Hobb said softly. His usually wild hair was plastered close to his skull by the rain. "You promised your father. You accepted the penance." Thomas shook his head angrily. "There are a score of bastards here, Father." He indicated the archers crouching under the rain's lash, "who've murdered more men than I have. Go and harrow their souls and leave mine alone." Father Hobb shook his head. "You've been chosen, Thomas, and I'm your conscience. It occurs to me, see, that if the Vexil supported Mortimer, then they can't love our king. If they'll be anywhere today, it'll be over there." He nodded towards the valley's far side, which was still blotted out by the pelting rain. "Then they'll live for another day, won't they?" Thomas said. Father Hobb frowned. "You think we're going to lose?" he asked sternly. "No." Thomas shivered. "It must be getting late in the afternoon, Father. If they don't attack now, they'll wait till the morning. That'll give them a whole day to slaughter us." "Ah, Thomas, how God loves you." Thomas said nothing to that, but he was thinking that all he wanted was to be an archer, to become Sir Thomas of Hookton, as Will had just become Sir William. He was happy serving the king, and did not need a heavenly lord to take him into weird battles against dark lords. "Let me give you some advice, Father," he said. "It's always welcome, Tom. First bastard that drops, get his helmet and mail. Look after yourself." Father Hobb clapped Thomas's back. "God is on our side. You heard the king much." He stood and went to talk with other men, and Thomas sat by himself and saw that the rain was lessening at last. He could see the far trees again, see the colours of the French banners and surcoats, and now he could see a mass of red and green crossbowmen at the other side of the valley. They were going nowhere, he reckoned, for a crossbow string was as susceptible to the damp as any other. "It'll be tomorrow," he called down to Jake. "We'll do it all again tomorrow." "Let's hope the sun shines," Jake said. The wind brought the last drops of rain from the north. It was late. Thomas stood, stretched, and stamped his feet. A day wasted, he thought, and a hungry night ahead. And tomorrow, his first real battle. An excited group of mounted men had gathered about the French king, who was still a half-mile from the hill where the largest part of his army had gathered. There were at least 2,000 men-at-arms in the rear guard who were still marching, but those who had reached the valley hugely outnumbered the waiting English.
2 to 1, sire,
Charles, the Count of Alençon, and the king's younger brother said vehemently. Like the rest of the horsemen, his surcoat was soaking, and the dye in its badge had run into the white linen. His helmet was beaded with water.
"We must kill them now," the count insisted.
But Philip of Valois' instinct was to wait. It would be wise, he thought, to let his whole army gather, to make a proper reconnaissance, and then attack next morning. But he was also aware that his companions, especially his brother, thought him cautious. They even believed him to be timid, for he had avoided battle with the English before, and even to propose waiting a mere day might make them think he had no stomach for the highest business of kings. He still ventured the proposal, suggesting that the victory would be all the more complete if it was just delayed by one day. "And if you wait," Alençon said scathingly, "Edward will slip away in the night, and tomorrow we'll face an empty hill."
"They're cold, wet, hungry, and ready to be slaughtered," the Duke of Lorraine insisted.
"And if they don't leave, sire," the Count of Flanders warned, "they'll have more time to dig trenches and holes."
"And the signs are good,"
John of Hainault, a close companion of the king, and the Lord of Beaumont added. "The signs?" the king asked. John of Hainault gestured for a man in a black cloak to step forward. The man, who had a long white beard, bowed low.
"The sun, sire," he said, "is in conjunction with Mercury and opposite Saturn. Best of all, noble sire, Mars is in the house of Virgo. It spells victory, and could not be more propitious."
And how much gold, Philip wondered, had been paid to the astrologer to come up with that prophecy. Yet he was also tempted by it. He thought it unwise to do anything without a horoscope, and wondered where his own astrologer was, probably still on the Abbeville road.
"Go now,"
Alençon urged his brother. Guy Vexil, the Count of Asterac, pushed his horse into the throng surrounding the king. He saw a green and red jacketed crossbowman, evidently the commander of the Genoese, and spoke to him in Italian. As the rain affected the strings, badly, Carlo Grimaldi, the Genoese leader, admitted. Crossbow strings could not be unstrung like the cords of ordinary bows, for the tension in the cords was too great, and so the men had simply tried to shelter their weapons under their inadequate coats. "We should wait till tomorrow," Grimaldi insisted. "We can't advance without pavises." "What's he saying?" Alençon demanded. The Count of Asterac translated for His Majesty's benefit, and the king, pale and long-faced, frowned when he heard that the crossbowmen's long shields that protected them from the enemy's arrows while they reloaded their cumbersome weapons had still not arrived. "How long will they be?" he asked plaintively, but no one knew. "Why didn't they travel with the bowmen?" he demanded, but again no one had an answer. "Who are you?" the king finally asked the count. "Asterac, sire," Guy Vexil said. "Ah." It was plain the king had no idea who or what Asterac was, nor did he recognize Vexil's shield that bore the simple symbol of the cross, but Vexil's horse and armor were both expensive, and so the king did not dispute the man's right to offer advice. "And you say the bows won't draw?" "Of course they'll draw," the Count of Alençon interrupted. "The damned Genoese don't want to fight. Bastard Genoese," he spat. "The English bows will be just as wet," he added. "The crossbows will be weakened, sire," Vexil explained carefully, ignoring the hostility of the king's younger brother. "The bows will draw, but they won't have their full range or force." "It will be best to wait?" the king asked. "It would be wise to wait, sire," Vexil said, "and it would be especially wise to wait for the pavises."
"Tomorrow's horoscope?"
John of Hainault asked the astrologer. The man shook his head.
"Neptune approaches the bendings tomorrow, sire. It is not a hopeful conjunction." "Attack now! They're wet, tired, and hungry," Alençon urged. "Attack now!"
The king still looked dubious, but most of the great lords were confident, and they hammered him with their arguments. The English were trapped, and a delay of even one day might give them a chance to escape. Perhaps their fleet would come to Le Crotoy. "Go now," they insisted, even though it was late in the day. "Go and kill, go and win. Show Christendom that God is on the side of the French. Just go now." And the king, because he was weak, and because he wanted to appear strong, surrendered to their wishes. So the oriflamme was taken from its leather tube and carried to its place of honor at the front of the men-at-arms. No other flag would be allowed to go ahead of the long, plain red banner that flew from its cross-staff and was guarded by 30 picked knights who wore scarlet ribbons on their right arms. The horsemen were given their long lances. Then the convoy closed together, so the knights and men-at-arms were knee to knee. Drummers took the rain covers from their instruments, and Grimaldi, the Genoese commander, was peremptorily told to advance and kill the English archers. The king crossed himself, while a score of priests fell to their knees in the wet grass and began to pray. The lords of France rode to the hill crest, where their mailed horsemen waited. By nightfall, they would all have wet swords and prisoners enough to break England forever. For the oriflamme was going into battle. God's teeth! Will Skeet sounded astonished as he scrambled to his feet. The bastards are coming! His surprise was justified, for it was late in the afternoon, the time when labourers would think of going home from the fields. The archers stood and stared. The enemy was not yet advancing, but a horde of crossbowmen was spreading across the valley bottom, while above them the French knights and men-at-arms were arming themselves with lances. Thomas thought it had to be a feint. It would be dark in another 3 or 4 hours, yet perhaps the French were confident they could do their business quickly. The crossbowmen were at last starting forward. Thomas took off his helmet to find a bowstring, looped one end over a horn tip, then flexed the shaft to fix the other loop in its nock. He fumbled and had to make 3 attempts to string the long black weapon. Sweet Jesus, he thought, but they were really coming. Be calm, he told himself, be calm. But he felt as nervous as when he had stood on the slope above Hookton and dared himself to kill a man for the very first time. He pulled open the laces of the arrow bag. The drums began to beat from the French side of the valley, and a great cheer sounded. There was nothing to explain the cheer. The men-at-arms were not moving, and the crossbowmen were still a long way off. English trumpets responded, calling sweet and clear from the windmill, where the king and a reserve of men-at-arms waited. Archers were stretching and stamping their feet all along the hill. 4,000 English bows were strung and ready, but there were half as many crossbowmen again coming towards them. And behind those 6,000 Genoese were thousands of mailed horsemen. "No pavises!" Will Skeet shouted, "and their strings will be damp!" "They won't have the reach for us." Father Hobbit appeared at Thomas's side again. Thomas nodded, but was too dry-mouthed to answer. A crossbow in good hands, and there were none better than the Genoese, should outrange a straight bow, but not if it had a damp string. The extra range was no great advantage, for it took so long to rewind a bow that an archer could advance into range and loose 6 or 7 arrows before the enemy was ready to send his second bolt. But even though Thomas understood that imbalance, he was still nervous. The enemy looked so numerous, and the French drums were great heavy kettles with thick skins that boomed like the devil's own heartbeat in the valley. The enemy horsemen were edging forward, eager to spur their mounts into an English line they expected to be deeply wounded by the crossbow's assault, while the English men-at-arms were shuffling together, closing their line to make solid ranks of shields and steel. The mail clinked and jangled. "God is with you!" a priest shouted. "Don't waste your arrows," Will Skeet called. "Aim true, boys, aim true. They ain't going to stand long." He repeated the message as he walked along his line. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Tom." 10,000 ghosts, Tom said. "There's more of the bastards than that," Will Skeet said. He turned and gazed at the hill. "Maybe 12,000 horsemen," he grinned. "So that's 12,000 arrows, lad." There were 6,000 crossbowmen and twice as many men-at-arms, who were being reinforced by infantry that was appearing on both French flanks. Thomas doubted that those foot soldiers would take any part in the battle, not unless it turned into a rout, and he understood that the crossbowmen could probably be turned back because they were coming without pavises and would have rain-weakened weapons. But to turn the Genoese back would need arrows, a lot of arrows, and that would mean fewer for the mass of horsemen whose painted lances, held upright, made a thicket along the far hilltop. "We need more arrows," he said to Skeet. "You'll make do with what you've got," Skeet said. "We all will. Can't wish for what you ain't got." The crossbowmen paused at the foot of the English slope and shook themselves into line before placing their bolts into their bows' troughs. Thomas took out his first arrow and superstitiously kissed its head, which was a wedge of slightly rusted steel with a wicked point and 2 steep barbs. He laid the arrow over his left hand and slotted its knocked butt onto the center of the bowstring, which was protected from fraying with a whipping of hemp. He half-tensed the bow, taking comfort from the used resistance. The arrow lay inside the shaft, to the left of the hand grip. He released the tension, gripped the arrow with his left thumb, and flexed the fingers of his right hand. A sudden blare of trumpets made him jump. Every French drummer and trumpeter was working now, making a cacophony of noise that started the Genoese forward again. They were climbing the English slope, their faces white blurs, framed by the grey of their helmets. The French horsemen were coming down the slope, but slowly and in fits and starts, as though they were trying to anticipate the order to charge. "God is with us!" Father Hob called. He was in his archer's stance, left foot far forward, and Thomas saw the priest had no shoes. "What happened to your boots, Father?" "Some poor boy needed them more than I did. I'll get a French pair." Thomas smoothed the feathers of his first arrow. "Wait!" Will Skeet shouted. "Wait!" A dog ran out of the English battle line, and its owner shouted for it to come back, and in a heartbeat half the archers were calling the dog's name. "Biter! Biter! Come here, you bastard! Biter!" "Quiet!" Will Skeet roared as the dog, utterly confused, ran towards the enemy. Off to Thomas's right, the gunners were crouched by the carts, linstocks smoking. Archers stood in the wagons, weapons half-braced. The Earl of Northampton had come to stand among the archers. "You shouldn't be here, my lord," Will Skeet said. "The king makes him a knight," the Earl said, "and he thinks he can give me orders." The archers grinned. "Don't kill all the men-at-arms, Will," the Earl went on. "Leave some for us poor swordsmen." "You'll get your chance," Will Skeet said grimly. "Wait!" he called to the archers. "Wait!" The Genoese were shouting as they advanced, though their voices were almost drowned by the heavy drumming and the wild trumpet calls. Biter was running back to the English now, and a cheer sounded when the dog at last found shelter in the battle line. "Don't waste your goddamn arrows," Will Skeet called. "Take proper aim, like your mothers taught you." The Genoese were within bow range now, but not an arrow flew, and the red and green coated crossbowmen still came, bending forward slightly as they trudged up the hill. They were not coming straight at the English, but at a slight angle, which meant that the right of the English line, where Thomas was, would be struck first. It was also the place where the slope was most gradual, and Thomas, with a sinking heart, understood he was likely to be in the heart of the fight. Then the Genoese stopped, shuffled into line, and began to shout their war cry. "Too soon," the Earl muttered. The crossbows went into the shooting position. They were angled steeply upwards, as the Genoese hoped to drop a thick rain of death on the English line. "Draw!" Skeet said, and Thomas could feel his heart thumping as he pulled the coarse string back to his right ear. He chose a man in the enemy line, placed the arrow tip directly between that man and his right eye, edged the bow to the right because that would compensate for the bias in the weapon's aim, then lifted his left hand and shifted it back to the left because the wind was coming from that direction. Not much wind. He had not thought of aiming the arrow. It was all instinct, but he was still nervous and a muscle was twitching in his right leg. The English line was utterly silent. The crossbowmen were shouting, and the French drums and trumpets deafening. The Genoese line looked like green and red statues. "Let go, you bastards," a man muttered, and the Genoese obeyed him. 6,000 crossbow bolts arced into the sky. "Now," Will said, surprisingly softly, and the arrows flew. Eleanor crouched by the wagon that held the archer's baggage. 30 or 40 other women were there, many with children, and they all flinched as they heard the trumpets, the drums, and the distant shouting. Nearly all the women were French or Breton, though not one was hoping for a French victory, for it was their men who stood on the green hill. Eleanor prayed for Thomas, for Will Skeet, and for her father. The baggage park was beneath the crest of the hill, so she could not see what was happening, but she heard the deep, sharp note of the English bowstrings being released, and then the rush of air across feathers that was the sound of thousands of arrows in flight. She shuddered. A dog tethered to the cart One of the many strays that had been adopted by the archers whimpered. She patted it.
"There will be meat tonight," she told the dog.
The news had spread that the cattle captured in Le Croteuil would be reaching the army today, if there was an army left to eat them.
The bows sounded again, more raggedly.
The trumpet still screamed, and the drum beats were constant. She glanced up at the hill crest, half expecting to see arrows in the sky, but there was only grey cloud, against which scores of horsemen were outlined. These horsemen were part of the king's small reserve of troops, and Eleanor knew that if she saw them spur forward, then the main line would have been breached. The king's royal standard was flying from the topmost vane of the windmill, where it stirred in the small breeze to show its gold, crimson, and blue. The vast baggage park was guarded by a mere score of sick or wounded soldiers who would not last a heartbeat if the French broke through the English line. The king's baggage, heaped on 3 white-painted wagons, had a dozen men-at-arms to guard the royal jewels.